On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot in Memphis, Tennessee, outside the Lorraine Motel. In the next hours, the streets of Washington, D.C. erupted in violence. Though Secret Service records show incidents throughout the capital city, the destruction was concentrated on 14th Street Northwest, 7th Street Northwest, and 8th Street Northeast. Over 1,000 buildings were damaged or completely destroyed. 2,000 homes were lost, 1,200 Washingtonians were injured, and 13 died. To restore order, President Johnson sent 13,000 National Guard troops into the streets of Washington. To tell the story of 4 days of violence in Washington, D.C., I think it's useful to turn back the clock and narrow to the lived experience of a single human, and expand from there. When news of King's murder arrived at 14th and U Street Northwest at 8:19 p.m., distraught Washingtonians began to filter outside. Among them was a civil rights activist by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael had made his name as part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but had recently been drawing crowds with fiery rhetoric rejecting nonviolent principles. The days of passive nonviolent resistance at lunch counters, singing "We Shall Overcome" and accepting the thud of a policeman's billy club were over. In a phrase, quote, "Stop singin' and start swingin'. White power should be met with black power." And so when Washingtonians saw Stokely on the streets of D.C. that night, they went to him. Ben W. Gilbert described Carmichael like a Pied Piper making his way around, gathering a crowd. If Stokely called for violence, some of those present would surely follow. If Stokely called for rebellion and pointed his finger a dozen blocks to the White House, they'd go that way. Then, cutting through the murmurs and vocal outbursts of the people, rang the sound of shattering glass. A 15-year-old boy had broken the window of a movie theater, crawled inside, and re-emerged with a bag of popcorn. This act was an inflection point. One broken pane of glass might lead to more. Carmichael pushed through the crowd to the boy. All eyes were on them. And so Stokely Carmichael had a decision to make. Would he encourage the boy and therein the mood of the mob, or would he admonish him, tell the boy and the others to head home? Which side of Stokely would prevail, the student nonviolent coordinator, or the one who told a crowd, quote, "The only way we're gonna stop them white men from whooping us is to take over"? And with that, welcome, explorers. I'm William C. Fox. For this project, I've dug into the archives of African-American newspapers of the DC area, pulled VHS archival footage, and digitized it. So if you'd like to support historical work like this on YouTube, go to patreon.com/William C. Fox. Kwame Ture was born with the name Stokely Carmichael. And as that's the name he carried through the events described here, that's the name we'll use. Stokely was born in Trinidad, brought to New York at age 11. After graduation, he moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard University. In 1961, he participated in the Freedom Rides, a nonviolent protest of segregated bus travel. After several arrests and nonviolent campaigns, he joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, pronounced SNCC. SNCC had been involved in organizing sit-ins and some of the Freedom Rides. One of its most famous members, John Lewis, had been beaten and arrested during those rides. SNCC were joint planners of the March on Washington, the occasion of the I Have a Dream speech. Again, John Lewis was there and gave a speech on the same day. When Carmichael joined SNCC in 1964, they were planning the Mississippi Summer Project, part of what came to be known as Freedom Summer. With a lack of federal action on civil rights, SNCC organizers took direct action. They sent a mixture of black activists and white students to Mississippi to register black Mississippians to vote and to establish what they called freedom schools for black children. They wouldn't wait for President Lyndon Johnson and civil rights legislation, they'd do it themselves. To the white establishment and racists in the general population of Mississippi, voter registration and school building was part of an invasion. As activist Hazel Brannon Smith heard on the streets of Mississippi in summer 1964, quote, "If everyone would just leave us alone, we'd work out all our problems." The white and black activists who invaded Mississippi that summer had clear photos taken, lists of contacts made, wills written. All in the case, they disappeared. And just 1 week after arriving in Mississippi, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner went missing. Weeks later, their car was found. then their corpses were too, murdered for the crime of registering voters in the Deep South. According to SNCC's Digital Gateway, by the end of Freedom Summer, quote, there had been 6 known murders, 35 known shootings, 4 people critically wounded, at least 80 volunteers beaten, and more than 1,000 people arrested. While the violence in Mississippi helped drum support for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it also highlighted the fact that a single piece of legislation or a series of legislation would never be enough. Further, the feds failed to prosecute the vast majority of the violence that was inflicted on activists, a pattern spanning decades. This helped sow doubt among some SNCC activists. Perhaps thinkers like John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King had it wrong. Maybe nonviolence wasn't the only way. Perhaps violence should be met with violence. Even before the Mississippi Summer Project, Stokely Carmichael was diverging in his thoughts. He declared nonviolent principles, so popular with mainstream civil rights leaders and the media, as, quote, utter nonsense, as BS. He didn't say BS. If Jesus could bring a sword, he could bring a gun. Quote, I'm not gonna let someone hit up the side of my head and die. No, you gotta fight back. Though he saw the benefit of nonviolent tactics to bring the vote to Black Mississippians, he didn't see suffrage as sufficient to bring power to the Black community. In fact, no action by whites in government would ever be enough because whites would never be fully committed. Here he is a little later in life criticizing nonviolence.
Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for Black people in the United States. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none.
In this way, Carmichael was echoing the sentiments of another man, Malcolm X, who had called Martin Luther King's March on Washington the farce on Washington. Who ever heard, wrote Malcolm, of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressors in lily pad pools with gospels and guitars and I have a dream speeches? To nonviolence, Malcolm X said this.
We're nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But we are not nonviolent with anyone who is violent with us.
Though not as radical as Malcolm X, Carmichael clearly started to lean that way. Quote, blacks must do things for themselves. Quote, blacks must organize in the Black community. Only Black people can convey the revolutionary idea that Black people are able to do things themselves. The term for this was Black power. Hope didn't derive from the white government, it derived from the self. Carmichael popularized Black power within SNCC and the larger civil rights movement. He believed that Black people, quote, had to work for power because this country does not function by morality, love, or nonviolence, but by power. And to come full circle now, part of this empowerment was self-defense, literal armament, purchasing guns, fighting back against oppression directly and in the moment. Stop singing, start swinging. Here's Carmichael in 1967 endorsing political violence from Black students in Nashville.
They've been telling you that the kids in Nashville started a riot. Number one, you ought to recognize it is not a riot, it is a rebellion. A rebellion. And number two, you ought to be proud of your Black brothers and sisters at Fifth because the honky cops touched one of them and they told them you got to touch all of us.
This is the Stokely Carmichael who entered the streets of DC in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. In fact, it's reported when he heard the news, he said, quote, now that they've taken Dr. King off, it's time to end this nonviolence BS. Again, I'm not saying the words, so this isn't suppressed by Team YouTube. I think by now you have a vision of Stokely, so let's visit Washington, D.C. Though the slave trade was banned in D.C. through the Compromise of 1850, there were thousands of enslaved people in Washington, D.C. at the start of the Civil War in 1861. There was also a large population of free people of color. Through the defense of D.C., or in the process of fleeing the South, seeking employment, refuge, D.C.'s Black population swelled by the end of the war. DC's population and diversity grew over the next century. By the 1960s, there was a black middle class in the district, but there was also desperate poverty. Things were difficult in the sprawling slums and back alley homes of families in the so-called colored man's paradise. As Constance Mclaughlin Green wrote in 1967, quote, "Unemployment and underemployment accounted for much of the poverty, preposterously low wages for most of the rest." A report released in 1965 told of Negro families striving to live on a budget that provided a maximum of 40 cents per person per day for food, clothing, medicine, transportation, entertainment, and sales tax. In DC, school segregation, 90% of public enrollments were black children, reflected segregated neighborhoods, private schooling, and white flight out of urban centers and into the suburbs. Unemployment for non-whites was 30%. And so when black Washingtonians heard of Dr. King's murder in Memphis, it awoke something. But enough from me, let's hear from Washingtonians who lived it. Oral histories from witnesses attest to the anger over the shooting. Alexander Padro, quote, "Dr. Martin Luther King basically was the last straw." Jacqueline Rogers Hart, quote, "They were showing their rage, their anger because of what had happened. Martin Luther King had been killed." Bonnie Perry, 13 years old in 1968, said people were, quote, "frustrated and angry that Martin Luther King had been assassinated and frustrated that there was nothing. It was like there was no hope for the future." Perhaps some in the crowd following Stokely Carmichael towards the People's Drugstore on 14th and U felt the same. However, rather than inciting violence, Carmichael was imploring stores to close out of respect for Dr. King. The crowd gathering behind him surely incentivized participation in the scheme. When Reverend Walter Fauntleroy confronted Carmichael saying, "This is not the way to do it, Stokely, let's not get anyone hurt," Carmichael responded, "All we're asking them to do is close the stores." Rather than playing provocateur, Carmichael seemed to be channeling the energy of the crowd towards non-violent catharsis. Perhaps he could see the real damage would be done to the community itself. Perhaps his instincts as a non-violent SNCC organizer kicked back in. Perhaps he just thought the timing was wrong. Either way, his actions on the street create a contrast with the rhetoric both before and after. As the crowd's energy shifted, Carmichael became more assertive, trying to send people home. When a 15-year-old boy broke a cinema window and re-emerged with popcorn, Carmichael made the decision to force him away from the theater and told him, "This is not the way. Get off the streets. This is not the time, brothers." The crowd continued to follow him. "Go home, go home, go home," Carmichael repeated. His warnings were no longer of use. As the Chicago Daily Defender put it, Stokely Carmichael had tried to talk the milling Negro youths into going home, but they ignored him. One anonymous looter explained later, quote, "Nobody was listening to Stokely. What I did because I wanted to do it." The crowd was becoming a mob. The sound of broken glass came from different directions. Johnny Jones, a barber who closed Eaton's barbershop at Carmichael's behest, recalled feeling that, quote, "The black man has just been pushed around too much." Another man yelled, "This is it, baby. It's gonna hit the fan. Let's get some MFers. Let's kill them all." Fires leapt. Except for some wealthy neighborhoods in northwest DC, the fires and violence spread across the district. DC police were overwhelmed and unable to contain the destruction and looting. As the chaos encroached on the White House, President Johnson ordered the activation of the National Guard. The epicenter on the stretches of 14th Street and Georgia Avenue were particularly damaged. Music venues, businesses, homes reduced to rubble. Squinting at the situation, it could appear as though vengeance was being taken against white America. 86% of the businesses lost or looted had white owners. Whites unlucky enough to be out on the streets were subject to assault. Here's an anecdote from the April 9th, 1968 Afro-American. "They didn't strike in haste. The attackers forced the pleading white man into a bent position so that the bald spot on top of his head was vulnerable to the blow. Then the tall, slim one carefully aimed and painted the brick on the skull. Though in pain, this symbolic white man looked relieved, as if thinking, it wasn't so bad, now it's over, and I'm still alive." However, a full view of the riots reveals a different story. The majority of the destruction was concentrated in black neighborhoods, against black homes, against businesses patronized by black customers. While 2 of the dead were shot by police, another 11 black victims were killed by other black people, including 3 who were found buried in burned out rubble. Witnesses from these neighborhoods and oral histories speculated about the mindset. First and foremost, there was frustration and anger. Second, there were political motivations among some. A reporter for the Washington Post met with 3 anonymous rioters who expressed political motivations and said they had been organizing with others for months. We needed an incident that would make it justifiable in the eyesight to the mass of people that do not agree with Black power. Among the racial strife was mixed, a tinge of class struggle. Ibrahim Mumin, a witness to the rioting, said in an oral history, quote, "These were commercial corridors in the neighborhood, and people were, in some respect, striking out where they considered the power structure was. The merchants were considered the people who were making money, but taking money out of the neighborhood." A couple people spoke out against the class divisions in the Afro-American on April 9th, 1968. Quote, "Those looting are people who have not been able to make a living because of their own poor thinking. Colored society is dividing those who have and those who don't." Community members who didn't participate expressed anger in the Afro-American. A person the newspaper called a prominent woman said, "If the dead can see, Dr. King will not be happy seeing the way some people have chosen to mourn him." A 49-year-old university lecturer said, quote, "This rioting and looting was the worst thing that could happen to any nation. It is worse than war." An editorial in the April 14th edition of the Afro-American added, "It should not take wise people long to see that if 1/10 of the population continues to waste itself and its resources in this way, victory cannot be the end result." So now that we've heard from so many Washingtonians, how are we to interpret all this? In totality, were the events of these 4 days a rebellion? Stokely Carmichael called the 1967 riots in Nashville a rebellion, and after failing to soothe the crowds on April 4th, 1968, he spent the following days using the language of rebellion. For example, the next day, April 5th, he said,
"White America killed Dr. King last night. She made a whole lot easier for a whole lot of black people today. There no longer needs to be intellectual discussions. Black people know that they have to get guns. White America will live to cry that she killed Dr. King last night. It would have been better if she had killed Rat Brown and or Stokely Carmichael. But when she killed Dr. King, she lost."
This video therefore carries the name, the DC Rebellion of 1968, but some subtlety and some course correction is needed from me. The Wikipedia page for these events calls them the 1968 Washington, D.C. riots. The first history written about them in 1968 called them riots, as did the most recent book on the subject by Samuel Walker, who wrote, "It was clear, however, that the great majority of participants neither burned and looted to make a political statement nor acted with a political objective in mind. The Washington disorders were not a rebellion undertaken to accomplish a specific goal or to overthrow the power structure in the city." That's right, that's a legitimate position to take, and I'm not here to split hairs in the historiography or whip out Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Instead, I want to come back to Stokely Carmichael, who envisioned the events across the nation as becoming something more like a rebellion, or at the very least, a clear instance for armament. And he wasn't alone in this thinking, as we heard from several others already. The thought process seems to be born from the search for a new tactic. At the end of the 1960s, nonviolent resistance seemed played out to some. When the police beat protesters on Bloody Sunday, it helped garner support from the president and the Congress to move on a civil rights bill faster. But the opponents of equality learned from this. Civil rights could be better opposed with a smile than a billy club. When MLK tried to bring an End the Slums campaign to Chicago, Illinois in 1966, rather than encountering the billy club of police, he was met with a deferential Mayor Daley. The mayor's intention was to speak well but walk slow, reducing Dr. King's ability to drive public opinion through media images of state retaliation to civil rights activists. This stalling was part of what convinced people like Carmichael that nonviolence could only get you so far. This wasn't Petrograd in 1917 or Saint-Domingue in 1791. The power structure was not weak. The USA was a global behemoth. The DC riots took place in the heart of its capital. There was no space for a boiling over of frustrations to lead to a real rebellion and then to something we might call a revolution. The frustration never diverted from self-inflicted pain. DC's rebellion was Stokely's mirage. What happens when the status quo is overwhelming, when there is no tactic to instigate rapid change and things stall, when decades tick by, when some continue to openly deny the presence of injustice while others only speak well? When the arc of history doesn't bend towards justice, it meanders. Not only were many residents left without homes or other basic necessities in the immediate aftermath, the events of 1968 had a lasting impact on these neighborhoods. 40% of the 1,352 damaged or destroyed businesses stayed permanently closed, causing more than 5,000 job losses. Reverend Channing Phillips expressed hope to rebuild in the April 16, 1968 edition of the Afro-American. The rebuilding must be planned by people in whose neighborhoods it will take place. The rebuilding must be physically done by the people in whose neighborhoods it will take place. The day will not permit backslapping business as usual, but demands creative leadership. But that did not happen. As 50 years passed, many areas stayed in disrepair until 21st century gentrification. While these areas of DC appear quite vibrant today, the scar of 1968 remains. If you're interested in the 1960s and its history, consider this video on Kennedy and Khrushchev's relationship during the space race as your next stop, or support history videos like this on YouTube by following the Patreon link here-ish. Later, y'all.